Hello everyone, welcome to another video from the Tradelands Nation. Today we are covering one of the hottest, most frequently requested topics of our group, and that is combat ship ratings, which is a deep dive into our previous all-around ratings, which follows a similar format to what you will see today. This was an incredibly challenging piece for us to do. It takes us about a week to test a single ship, run through all of its analytics, and then try to score them. And of course, whenever the developers update a ship, we have to rerun every test that we're doing that's related to that ship, which means we've been at this for almost a year now. So strap yourselves in because this video is going to be a very long and very dry one, unless you like geeking out the stats the way we do, in which case we know you will absolutely love what we have to say today. All right, let's get into it. We ran combat tests on every single ship and combination that we could get our hands on. This video will be built into 3 parts, and we have a lot of chapter markers spread throughout this video to make it easier for you to jump around and watch it piecemeal if that's the way you prefer to watch videos like this. The first part will introduce the test, what it is and what it isn't, the assumptions we made, as well as the definitions for terms that we are using. The second part will be an individual review of every ship that we reviewed. If you are looking for endgame stack ranking of these ships, that will be in our third and final section, which is our summary reports. This is our stack rankings, side-by-side analysis, and some recommendations based on our experience using all of these ships. Also, the charts that we show on this page may become hard to read, but don't worry, we will be posting high-resolution versions of all of these on our website where you can download them and use them for your own personal analysis if you would like to do that. Also, the data is valid as of November 17th, when we closed our last test. But as new data is available or as modifications are made to these ships or even new ships are added, the charts on the website will be continually updated as they occur. So if the chart on the website is different than what we are showing on this video here today, the website version is probably more up-to-date than the one that you're seeing here. For this test, we define combat as 1v1 matchups where the only possible outcome is the complete and total destruction of your enemy. As we stated in our past tests, all ships that we rate must have cannons, have a cargo hold, and be able to move independently either with sails or engines. However, because cargo has nothing to do with combat, we are replacing this requirement. Instead, our definition of combat means no fleeing, boarding, or intentional disarming of enemy ships. We call this the human element, and we eliminate it for these tests as we are not verifying individual player performance. That's a task that's best left to navies and pirate crews. Second, we do not rate ships that require limited time vouchers, purchases through auctions, or are otherwise unobtainable by average players. And finally, this is a statistical review only. It's a showcase, if you will, of all the data we collected to hopefully help players in their journey through Tradelands. We are evaluating ship performance and ship-to-ship combat only, and we go to extreme measures to make sure that we keep to this philosophy. As an example of this, if you were a helmer, you were required to follow a strict rules of engagement or ROE. It is essentially saying that you must always attempt to place your heaviest broadside at your opponent's weakest side, even in cases where it doesn't seem to make sense. And there's a list of specific exceptions for how to engage your enemy when this is not possible. That's just an example. But all of this means that we expect some players will be able to exceed the performance that we show here today, and that is intentional. As the adage goes, a ship can only be as good as her crew and captain. If you are getting better performance in these ships, then that's most likely due to your abilities as the ship's crew or captain, rather than the ship's inherent abilities. Next is the key performance ratings, or what we refer to as KPIs. For each ship, we will show a total grade. By the way, we do not grade on a curve. The letter grade is based on the percentage obtained in each category, and the total grade is the summation of all of the subcategories that we measured combined into one rating. In case you don't like this approach, we are going to give you the most relevant categories and show you the ratings for those so you can use those to measure the ship's performance if you prefer. Each ship will be shown at the level it was graded at. This becomes important later. Next is firepower, which is essentially the maximum damage per second, or DPS, that we obtained during a combat session with that ship. This is calculated in 2 ways. First, the total hit points of the ship it sunk divided by the total time in seconds that it took to sink that ship after the first hit was made. The second way is specifically relevant if it didn't win the battle, is the maximum damage dealt over a full course of a minute of combat, not just a single volley but sustained over time. It's measured by the opponent's loss in hit point percentage divided by 60 seconds, or 1 minute. The star rating represents the highest of these two values. Each star is worth 170 DPS, and we are not rounding for this number. War, or wins above available replacements, is defined as the winning percentage against ships that are at or below the listed level for that ship. We do it this way because it's unfair to expect a ship to beat one that cannot be obtained by a player. Those are ships that are of higher level. We do still run these ships up against higher level ships, but they are not factored into the war category. Support percentage is the value that a ship adds when it is not the direct target of a combat. To be clear, this is different than the current Tradelands definition of support. For example, the Poseidon is considered a support ship by players, but what they actually mean is that this ship is effective when it receives support from other ships. In our definition, support means your ability to influence the outcome of a combat against two other ships, such as turning a loss into a win for a ship that would have otherwise lost that matchup. The percentage shown is the total number of matches that this ship was successfully able to influence. Finally, value, which is rated in dollars or doubloons instead of a percentage. This used to be our heaviest and most important category since it's very important for leveling. This is effectively your return on investment. If you pay more for a combat ship, then you expect it to perform better in combat as a result. The ratings do not consider outside values such as privateering and cargo trading in its numerical evaluation, only on how much tonnage in doubloons it was able to sink. For today's ratings, we are using an S to F tier system. In general, anything rated D or F is not recommended for combat. C and above are largely us just being nitpicky. To get to a C, you had to be competitive or outright win 3/4 of your engagements, which is actually incredible if you think about that. So take that for what it's worth. A C will tend to be more on the situational or rock, paper, scissors like combat style. Anything B and above you really can't go wrong with, and in the A and S tiers, these ships tended to perform well overall and are recommended purchases at their level. We are going to review these ships in order of level. That will help you see how these ships look and match up against each other as you progress through the game. Let's start with level 1. The Lark is first. A general rule of thumb is that all level 1 ships are not recommended to buy. That's because the Sparrow is a free ship given to you when you start the game. The Lark is a crosswind capable ship, but it doesn't really add anything beyond what you have already at the start of the game. Next is the level 1 Sparrow. Since you already get one of these at the start of the game, building another one is purely optional and doesn't really add anything. It performs better in combat than its fellow level 1 companions, but your objective is to move beyond level 1, so you should skip this ship for combat purposes. The next and final level 1 ship is the Swallow. Its combat performance is nearly identical to the Sparrow. It does have a 9-point advantage over the Lark, but is outclassed against anything higher than level 1. It's better to just wait for a higher level ship in this case. At level 2, there was only one ship, and it is the Heron. This is a trade ship, not a combat ship, but it is technically our first 1-star firepower ship. It performs decent against ships that are below its level, and it has some value in convoy-style trade runs, but these convoy-style trade runs are not in the game anymore due to low demand being a global cooldown. So as a result, it's usually a liability and considered an easy target for junior to mid-level pirate crews. It's not recommended for combat. Level 3 is where it starts to get interesting. The Dart is one of the first good combat ships available to players. It has a 1-star firepower rating and generally performs well against low-level trade ships due to its speed and maneuverability. That makes it a good privateer, and that is the capacity in which you will most likely use this unless you are actually doing trade runs. The Dart is a good purchase. Even at higher levels, I still use this ship as a quick personal shuttle. It's useful when you need to get somewhere without drawing attention to yourself because you will appear like a low-level player and not worth anyone's time, and anyone who does bother you is likely to find you not worth the hassle of trying to engage you against other potential targets that those players would have available to them. Next at level 3 is the Starling. This is another potential privateer ship with a broadside of light cannons and crosswind maneuverability. We found it slightly less capable in combat when compared to the Dart, and as a result we do not recommend this ship and instead will point you to the more versatile Dart as the one to buy at level 3 if you are interested in a crosswind ship. At level 4 we have an upgraded version of the Dart, and that is the Bullet. Effectively, the only real change is the addition of a chaser to the front. However, if your sole reason for upgrading from the Dart to the Bullet is to receive this chaser cannon, you should know that this just amounts to an upgrade of effectively 134 DPS, which is what you get in the Dart, to 168 DPS, which is what you get in the Bullet. That's 30 DPS improvement. Enough to just barely keep pace with the level progression so far, but I will warn you, at level 5, you're going to see twice the DPS of combat ships than what the Bullet can offer today, meaning it's better to just wait it out instead of buying this ship if that was your sole reason for buying it. That said, if you are at level 4 and you don't already have a Dart, then the Bullet is a good option in that case, since it too can be used as a personal transporter later in the game. Next is the Pelican, a level 4 trade ship. If the Dart was meant to be the counter to the Heron, then the Bullet is the counter to the Pelican. This is essentially an upgraded version of the Heron, and its combat performance mirrors the Heron as well. It can mount heavy cannons, but unless you can form up into some sort of convoy, this doesn't really do a whole lot for you. In other words, you buy this ship for its trading capabilities if that's what you need, but you don't buy it for its combat performance. At level 5, we have our first 2-star firepower ship, and that is the Kestrel. This is your entry-level mortar ship. However, it actually does a decent job as far as combat is concerned. It has a 2-cannon broadside and a mortar that is mounted as a chaser. And in a way, it's essentially a Bullet, but with long-range guns on the front instead. This ship requires a crew of just 3 players to work at full capacity, which actually is saying a lot. It means that you will have an easier time with combat missions. Those are the AI-generated ones. And pickup groups are going to be easier to form, as long as someone within that group has experience with mortaring. Also, this is the only 2-star warship available to players at level 5 or lower, so it's a good choice if you are going down the career path of being a mortar specialist. But if not, you can just as easily bypass this ship and wait to see what is available at level 6 instead. Next is the Pheasant, a level 5 trade ship that mounts a decent broadside for its level. In public servers, you aren't going to be rocking any hardcore combat though, but it is one of the recommended early game traders, and the broadside should be seen as some insurance against low-level pirates, but nothing more. You won't see this in a lot of combat. It's going to be outclassed fairly quickly, and it's popular amongst traders because it sits along the trading curve, with a sustained trade velocity of 444 doubloons per minute. Meaning the cannons are used more for passengers than they are for actual fighting. So build this as a trade ship, but go with the Kestrel if combat is your level 5 goal. Now we move into level 6, and this is where you will want to build your first combat ship, because at this level, you have the best combat ships available to you that you will have for a while. The first on this list is the Dragon, a level 6 steamship and the first steamship available to most players. Unfortunately, the cost of this ship at level 6 will make it difficult to purchase until you are a higher level, but it does give players some unique combat options if they were able to afford it. Chief among them is the ability to harass ships upwind. The Dragon is often used in privateering for this purpose, especially against other steamships, with the notable example being the Demeter. The Dragon has a Speed 7 engine, which means it can keep pace with the Demeter and the Ceres, which also have Speed 7 engines, and the Dragon is faster than them when going downwind. It can also chase down other ironclads like the Binglehopper and the Neptune, 2 ironclad ships that have a speed of 6. So the Dragon's versatility in this marauding style of warfare where you're moving in and out of combat could be excellent as long as you don't get caught going the wrong way. In head-to-head combat, this is where the Dragon cannot evade forever. It only just barely receives a 2-star rating on our scale. It has a DPS of 254, only 4 points above this threshold to receive a 2-star, which means it's underpowered at this level, Your helming skill will matter here because you will need to maximize the value of your steam engines to outclass other level 6 ships. And as a result, we rated this ship as a C for combat performance, but it has a lot of upside for players who are good at handling it. So there is some potential to outperform what this shows on paper. To explain what we meant by that last comment, we now turn to the Manta, a level 6 mortar ship. But not just any mortar ship, it mounts a heavy mortar in the chaser position. Unlike the Dragon, which just barely inched its way into the 2-star firepower rating, the Manta missed getting a 3-star rating by just 8 points, coming in with a DPS of 408 and some change. If you needed another way to look at this ship, its broadside is essentially the same as the level 5 Pheasant, but it carries a mortar instead of extra cargo. And moreover, it's one of the few ships in the game that can even mount a heavy mortar, and that means it's pretty much a requirement for anyone who is aspiring to be a mortar specialist. This ship is one of the top 2 best performers of any ship under level 10, and as a result, it's an S-tier ship on our ship rating scale. One important note about this ship, we found that if the Manta was able to score first strike, that means it hits its opponent before the opponent hits it, the chance of winning the engagement, either in a support or a direct attack scenario, increased by a total of 12%. When you isolate that to just enemy mortar ships, scoring a hit increased your chance to win by 25%, or a quarter of all engagements involving that mortar ship. That means in a rock, paper, scissors type matchup, the Manta is the counter to enemy mortar ships when placed in a counter battery role. So, just in case I didn't make it clear enough, this is an excellent ship to build for anyone who likes mortars. Next at level 6 is the Marlin, a trade ship that also mounts a decent broadside. This is the first of the dedicated trade ships that can also defend themselves against most pirate ships. It is a solid 2-star firepower ship. It has a 4 heavy cannon broadside, which is probably larger than anything you have available when you first hit level 6. And pirate ships typically carry less hardware than what the Marlin has, so you can effectively force them to work at engaging you. This is usually through maneuvering to lock you into a position where you can't respond, or attempting to directly board you, especially if you're carrying cargo. On public servers, the Marlin proves to be somewhat versatile. You can trade in it, but if a multi-ship combat erupts in front of you, a 4 heavy cannon broadside can still do some damage in a line of battle. Sure, this won't be the same as a dedicated level 6 fighter like the Shark or Orca, but it's enough to still be potent. And as a result, we rate this as an A tier ship, but still look at this as a trade ship first before you look at it as a dedicated combat ship. Our next level 6 ship is the Orca. Branded as a privateering ship, we don't think it does a good job in this, but instead, we rate it as an S tier in ship combat. This is the only ship below level 10 that received a 3-star firepower rating. It outclassed any ship we put it up against at level 6 and below, and was able to easily compete head-to-head against ships up into level 9, with the Phoenix and the Badger, a ship that's not even on this chart by the way, as the only ones that could consistently beat it. Brawler variants and ships with higher hull points tended to fare better against the Orca, mostly because the Orca was delivering a consistent level of firepower, meaning we saw the DPS remain consistent between 364 and 440 throughout the engagement. In other words, this meant that winning through attrition was how the Orca was doing it. This is damage over time rather than through creative maneuvering. In our opinion, it's best to just ignore the shipwright's comment about this ship. Yes, its chasers do make it perfect for running down the enemy, but I wouldn't be afraid to engage them with this ship directly either. It's more than capable of going toe-to-toe against any other dedicated warship that is available at level 6 or below. And before we move on, we will also point out that the Orca is the first ship that we've reviewed that receives a positive support rating, meaning it was able to influence the outcome of engagements in fleet-type matchups. The next ship at level 6 is none other than the Shark. This is supposed to be the dedicated warship of this level, and it does that, kind of. It has the same firepower rating as the Marlin, which is also a level 6 ship, and we have seen firsthand that players are able to get this ship to outperform its on-paper statistics, so practicing in this ship will yield some effective results over time. But the real comparison to make here is against the Orca. I'm going to start by reviewing the publicly available stats, and that means I'm going to walk over to the shipwright. As you can see, the Orca has the same broadside as the Shark. The Orca has chasers, and the Shark does not. The Orca has more hull points than the Shark. The Orca has more cargo than the Shark. And they both have the same exact sailing characteristics and speed. The Shark, however, has one very critical advantage over the Orca. That is, it can carry 20. Hear me, 20 more cannonballs than the Orca. That's 5 extra volleys. Means you can stay in the fight for an extra minute. But if you did somehow manage to get a pickup group that knows how to carry their own ammo, and believe me, that's harder than it sounds, then it essentially has no advantage over the Orca, and you should 100% build the Orca instead of the Shark. Now, there is anecdotal evidence that the Shark has better capabilities through the use of tilt and other creative ideas that players have brought to my attention, but we tested this and we found that the Orca's chasers are just a lot more effective than these, and the Orca in some cases can even perform some of the same maneuvers. The DPS difference between the Shark and the Orca is 70 hit points per second. Couple that with the Orca's 200-point hull advantage, it effectively means that the Orca is 3 volleys stronger than the Shark in a head-to-head matchup. Now think of your own experience in gunnery, and if you believe your crew will be able to overcome a 3-volley deficit, meaning you will make them miss 3 volleys and you will hit an additional 3 volleys, and then ask yourself if you'd rather deal with that situation or if you'd rather be in the other ship instead. Personally, I think this was just an oversight, so I'm not really going to read much into this just yet. But as it stands right now, the Shark is ranked in the A tier. It doesn't get rated as a positive support ship though, meaning the Orca is still the best ship to take at level 6 for combat. It's better than the Shark for the time being. Now we move into the level 7 ships, and the first of these is the Goose. This is a 2-star firepower ship, but is one of the first that mounts guns on an elevated platform, which means you can fire farther. Most gunners say they prefer these elevated gun platforms, and if you are one of these, then this ship is good for you. The Goose is a trade ship, but owing to its exceptional hull strength, it tends to get overlooked for its strength as a tank. In a bit of irony, the ship handles itself well against other combat ships, but is absolutely terrible against ships that sport good maneuverability. Examples of good maneuverability include the Marauder, Ibis, and Taipan. 2 of those 3 are also available at this level. The Goose represents a divergence in the types of trade ships that you can purchase, one where the line of ships goes towards dedicated traders that usually carry poor offensive capabilities as well. And then the other line is less capable traders but more heavily armed, like the Goose and the Mastiff. Personally, I don't recommend these middling ships like the Goose. Statistically, being average at just one thing leads you to being beaten by something that is more dedicated to the profession and therefore better. In the case of this video, that would be combat, because that's what we're talking about here. The Goose is good at soaking up damage, and it holds its own in that regard, but it struggles to outright defeat something that can outmaneuver it and find its blind spots, meaning that it has a very critical deficiency in a rock, paper, scissors matchup. Make sure you are supporting this ship with another combat ship, as paired attacks do work well with the Goose when it runs interference and it has blind spots covered effectively. Next, at level 7 is the Marauder. Don't be misled by the low statistics that I'm showing on the screen. This ship holds the record as the longest lived top-tier pirate ship in the game. It still technically holds that title despite its brief downgrade in favor of the Taipan before regaining its top spot about a year ago. This ship's advantage isn't in its ability to go toe-to-toe against other combat ships like we are forcing it to do here, but to instead evade these overpowered combat ships so that it can seek out the ships that it truly sees as its prey. The Marauder's abilities lie in its swift maneuverability, which allows it to lock into positions where enemies cannot respond, or to simply board its enemies and remove them as a threat that way. These aren't modeled in our scenarios because they rely too much on human instinct, but make no mistake, this ship is deadly in the hands of the right captain and crew. In our case, we were forcing the Marauder to go head-to-head, and in that capacity it struggled against any ship at or above level 7. I mean, it's carrying a 3-cannon broadside against ships that usually carry 4 heavy cannons at this point in the game. In fact, the chasers do more damage than the broadsides did in our tests due to how we were approaching each of its targets. However, as we mentioned in the Goose review, the Marauder's ability to lock into blind spots effectively means game over for that opposing ship. That means if you're using this ship, don't focus on raw firepower to win your battles. Instead, focus on close quarters, maneuvering, blind spots, and even boarding if you have the crew to do it. As a result, the Marauder receives a D on this chart, but it is the recommended ship to purchase at level 7. Buy it for its privateering ability, its excellent maneuverability, and of course, its capability as one of the fastest ships in the game. The next level 7 ship is the Taipan, which is available with scrap at Harrisburg. At the time of its launch, the Marauder had received a nerf to its performance capabilities, making this, the Taipan, briefly the best pirate ship in the game. That has since been corrected, however, and what remains is a vanity ship that is overpriced and underpowered for what it can do. The Taipan is a very light ship, mounting a light 2-cannon broadside that barely hits a 1-star firepower rating. In our tests, the smaller profile allowed it to stand up against larger ships for longer durations than its hull points lead you to believe. Ships with higher gun platforms tended to have a harder time hitting this ship, but its inability to do consistent long-term damage meant that it wasn't able to do much in return, leading to some lengthy engagements that all ended predictably against the Taipan. This is the second ship on our list to receive an F rating. This isn't a fighting ship, and it wasn't meant to be one either. At its height, it was a privateering ship, not a combat ship. This is still used as a vanity ship and a personal transport, and the fact that you can fully man it with just 2 people does give it some advantages in that sense. The next ship is the Widgeon. It has a 2-star firepower rating and receives an overall rating of A. However, the Widgeon receives an S tier rating when compared to other combat ships that are available at level 7 or below. This is due to its damage per second, which came in at 375 points. The only 2 ships that had higher DPS at this level were the Orca and the Manta, but the Widgeon has a hull strength of 13,000 points, meaning it can stay in the fight longer than either of these 2 ships, which averaged 9,000 hull points only. If that didn't make sense, I'll say it another way. The Widgeon was able to stay consistently at 15% or higher winning percentage than any ship at level 7. The main issue with this ship is its speed, though, which made the front-facing chasers kind of pointless. We didn't get much damage out of them. We got more damage output from this ship by simply maneuvering our broadside into position and firing volleys into our opponents until they were out of range, then moving the ship back in range and doing it all over again. Do know that against low-hulled ships, firing at long range was actually more of a disadvantage, as the tall hull of the Widgeon made it easier for the ships firing at angle to hit us than we could hit them. Now, originally we believed this ship was meant to act as sort of a shepherd among the sheep, where the sheep would be Goose trading ships that are running on high-risk trade routes. But since most traders don't use the Goose anymore, and there are other ships of the same design with heavier broadsides in the next few levels, it doesn't carry the same novelty that it used to, so many players tend to just skip this ship outright. But that said, the ship can hold its own. It is a purpose-built combat ship that works well as a tank, and thus it is a recommended purchase at level 7, but it may not be something you will readily carry in your inventory or into combat once you hit level 10. Next, we are into the level 8 ships, and the first one is the Beaver. Level 8 is the first level where we see variants appear in ships. We ran all of the variants as if they were independent ships, and then we take the best result between those variants of each matchup. This is based on the assumption that players will always try to pick the variant that best applies to each situation. The variant that was the top performer in most matchups with the Beaver was actually the Sentinel variant. However, most people will be using this ship as a trader, since that's where the ship's true strength lies. The ship is a solid C-tier combat ship. It has a top DPS of just under 300 and averaged around 280 DPS in longer matchups. That's good enough for a 2-star rating. It has mixed results when compared to other ships, but let's remember that this is one of the top performers on the trading charts, with it having one of the best trade velocity ratings of any ship under level 10, at nearly 600 doubloons earned per minute. Thus, this is recommended as a trade ship when building. The only downside is that level 8 happens to be the level where some interesting alternatives are also available to you, notably the Ibis, which if you can only afford one ship at level 8, you might want to take that one instead of this, the Beaver. But at the end of the day, the Beaver has only situational combat performance. It is a C tier ship, and there are other better options available at level 8, so I would skip this ship for combat if that's why you are building it. Next up is the Fox, a level 8 steamship. Our comments are likely to be controversial here, since we rate all of the ship's variants as if they were the same ship, taking the best results in every matchup, and the one variant that performs the best in this case is the classic variant of the Fox. And unfortunately, this one is no longer available to players. The reason for this is due to the restructure of combat ships that happened earlier this year. Many of the steamships, notably the Phoenix, saw firepower reductions, and in the result of the Phoenix, it lost both of its forward-facing mortars, and as a result, the Fox's classic variant is one of the last steamships available that mount a mortar in the chaser position. That means the classic variant can attack ships at angles and distances that opposing ships cannot respond to, meaning you can win engagements in some cases where you never received even a single hit. And we can actually measure the importance of this through statistics, and we call it first strike. First strike is a measure of how much more likely a ship is to win an engagement anytime it made the first hit in a combat matchup. In the classic variant's case, this was a 15 to 25% improved winning percentage if your mortar hit before any ship was able to hit you. Moreover, this was consistently received, meaning it wasn't just against one or two ships that were kind of anomalies, but we saw this across nearly every matchup that we conducted. For the record, most ships have a first strike average of about 5%, so a 15 to 25% is a big deal. Most ships will average around 60 points in first strike, but the Fox gets a whopping 117 in this category. The next closest ships to it are the Steam Goose at 110 points and the Prometheus at 107. Just putting that into perspective for you, that's the class of combat ships that the Fox is competing in. Those are its contemporaries whenever you have the classic variant on. Moreover, this variant has cannons on all four sides, meaning it doesn't have any blind spots, so as long as your helmer stays alert and your gunnery crew, which you only need 3 to be fully manned, are decently competent at firing at long range, then this ship is very good, nigh unbeatable in some circumstances. But that said, we do end up rating this as a B tier. Consider that an underperformance rating. Its main trouble came when it competed against its fellow steamships, which could prevent it from maneuvering when following our prescribed rules of engagement, and the way to win against this ship was to get in close, where it can't effectively use its steam mortar effectively, or if using other variants, make sure that you avoid getting locked into a broadside duel where you are outmatched. At level 8, there are ships that carry more raw firepower than you in a Fox, and your hull of 10,000 will not hold up against this type of duel for long. Our next ship to review at level 8 is the Ibis. Like other ships with variants, we perform the matchups in all of their existing variants and then use the top performing variant in each of our benchmarks. The Ibis was overall a 2-star firepower ship and is rated as a C in our combined rating, but that only tells part of the story. The Ibis is actually one of the most versatile ships in the game right now. Unlike other ships where the variants might be just a nominal difference in most cases, the Ibis can pretty much mirror the exact stats as other ships. More specifically, nearly all of the privateering ships. For example, the Racer class variant gives you nearly identical performance to the Marauder. And the Hauler variant, yes that's right, I said Hauler, has roughly the same performance as the Corsair. And if you are into carronade fighting, the Brawler's 8 carronades mean that you are matching the firepower of nearly every other 4-cannon broadside ship in the game, because you have the speed and maneuverability to actually use those carronades in close quarters combat. So the total grade for the Ibis should be viewed as more of a recognition of the ship's versatility than a knock on its overall combat performance. Still, it will struggle in dedicated combat situations where it is taking direct fire. It's going to outperform its on-paper statistics, though, due to several factors that we're not measuring here, such as the roof, which adds good crew protection, but the ship's best value isn't combat per se, since the other dedicated combat ships will outperform it, but it's unmatched in its ability as a privateer. Right now, this is the best privateering ship in the game. It's better than the Marauder even, and it's held that rank for a while. No, scratch that. It's The Ibis is actually the Marauder, but with variants, and that makes it even better than the Marauder. This is the ship to get at level 8 right now, hands down, unless the Fox's classic variant comes back, in which case you should get that instead. But you are missing out if you don't get the Ibis. I mean, there's a reason why virtually every pirate crew in the game right now owns an Ibis. And we think even traders will do well in this ship as well. The next level 8 ship is the Otter. If there is a running theme at level 8, it's that there are a lot of good ships but no great ones, and the Otter is another example of this. That said, this is another ship with variants, and while the Interceptor performs decent in some cases, the standard variant had slightly better performance in the majority of engagements that we put against this ship. It is a 2-star firepower ship, obtaining a consistent 370 to 375 DPS in most of its engagements. It has a 4 heavy cannon broadside and is extremely cheap for what you are getting. It comes in at a total price of around 145,000 in doubloons and materials, which is actually very good. Most ships that can mount that kind of firepower coupled with its level of maneuverability cost you at least 250,000 in doubloons and materials. Calculating its ROI, that means the amount of ships it sank in cost in doubloons versus the cost to sink a ship. It was almost 80% better than any ship available at level 8 or lower. Only the Serpent and the Orca did better in ROI, and the Serpent was only a 2% better, which is well within the margin of error, so it's pretty safe to say that these two are really tied for second place in this category. Plus, while it's out of scope for this test, which focuses on head-to-head matches against players, I've seen other players getting good results in the AI combat missions in this ship as well. So it seems like this is a good pickup, especially if you're just a casual player, and it shouldn't break the bank if you want to get it either, which is an added bonus. And lastly, I'll also add that the Otter was a part of a class of ships that got a major facelift this year, making it a good cosmetic choice as well as a cost-effective combat one. So consider that when you are deciding if you want to buy this ship or not. The next ship is the Serpent. It's a 2-star firepower ship and receives an overall grade of A on our combined score. If I had to sum up this ship in one sentence, I would call it a Marlin, but with better crosswind capability. This ship received a facelift this year, which condensed the deck and placed the cannons at a slope instead of on the flat deck on its previous model. This is notable because it has a unique characteristic that isn't available in any other ship that I've tested, and it has to do with the placement of its pivot point. Most ships pivot on an axis that is located amidships, but the Serpent pivots on a point that is slightly in front of the pilot's house. This actually made a difference in our combat tests, as we did notice that the forward cannons had better hit performance than the ones in the back, leading me to believe that this is probably a ship with some untapped power that a future crew might discover. It's not featured in roleplays, and I rarely see any crews at all testing out the Serpent's features, so I might just be missing something here, or players are remembering what this ship used to be like, and it was much worse in its old configuration, and then they haven't looked at it since. But overall, this ship did very well in our combat matchups, owing to some unique characteristics. The average DPS was 373, on par with the other 4-cannon broadside ships available, and it consistently beat every ship at level 9 or lower except the Badger and the Phoenix. And it won 2/3 of all the matchups that we put against its fellow junk-rigged ship, the Corsair. The Helmer still receives decent protection despite its elevated position, and our test crews were able to bring a broadside to bear on a rear-facing opponent 3 seconds faster on average than other ships. So there is that. If you own the Serpent already, I'd consider pulling it out and seeing if its handling matches your style. I hesitate to call this a rock, paper, scissors type of feel to this ship. It's more like it needs a captain willing to break it in and get a feel for her to see if it handles well. In my own personal opinion, I found it very awkward to handle without practice, at least when I first tried it. The cluttered deck makes crewing feel very different as well, but once I worked out some of the nuances, I did like some of the maneuvering capabilities, which are far better than its older counterpart. At level 9, we start to see our first galleon-style ships. There are 3 of them. The first one is the Cutlass. This ship has a 2-cannon broadside and a very good downwind speed. That's enough for a 1-star firepower rating, and unfortunately it isn't going to cut it at this level. This is not a combat ship, it's a trade ship, and it follows the progression tier that started with the Goose, where some trade ships are dedicated trade ships with high cargo capacity, and the other tier is cargo ships with less capacity, but they are also heavily armed. The Cutlass is the first group. The Cutlass is going to be an F tier ship for the purposes of combat. Some players will undoubtedly point out that this ship only requires a crew of 3 to be fully manned, and while true, once these cannons are sniped off because they are in the open, you run the risk of having nothing to shoot with. The Stiletto, which is coming up in a few moments, is essentially the same as this ship, but it has a smaller profile and it has an additional broadside gun, and that amounts to nearly 100 DPS improvement over the Cutlass's current 186 DPS. Moreover, it has a speed of 10, meaning it can't even outrun most ships that are going up against it, especially pirate ships available at lower levels than this ship. If you are going to trade run in a ship that has minimal armament, you need to be able to beat your opponent in some other way. And if running isn't the way to do it, then boarding is your last option. But with a crew of 3, that's just asking for suicide. So overall, this ship is not recommended for combat. The other 2 galleons, those being the Falchion and the Stiletto, are the better choices. And that brings up the Falchion, which is the best performing of the 3 galleon types at level 9. The ship receives a C as its overall grade and has a firepower rating of 2 stars. Despite this, it's important to note that the ship obtained an overall DPS of 308, which is the best of the level 9 galleons. It has decent maneuverability, but it's also the largest profile of these 3 ships as well. The Falchion is one of my personal favorites at level 9, but that's due to its incredible cosmetic options. Only the Gargoyle outperforms this ship in that regard, but then, in late October, the Falchion received its own figurehead, and I have to say that evened the playing field quite a bit, especially because it was free. And at this point, both of those ships are in a dead heat between which one receives the top rating, and the Cutlass and the Stiletto are in a close second place in this regard. But this isn't a cosmetic review, it's a combat one. The C rating is a reflection of that. While the ship does decent in head-to-head matchups, it didn't perform any better than the options already available to you. This is where the war scale matters, and why we do it at the current level instead of as a stack rank. That's because the C ranking says you are most likely already owning a ship that will give you the same level of performance. That is to say, it can compete against all ships at level 9 or lower. So here's my summary sentence on the Falchion's performance. It can compete against all ships at level 9 and lower, with the exception of the Badger and the Phoenix. If you listened to some of my previous commentary on other ships, you heard me say that exact same thing multiple times already. So my advice is to buy this ship because you think it looks cool, not because you want to dominate the battlefield with it. It's a decently armed middling trade ship at level 9, but you should be aiming for ships with a 4-cannon broadside at this point in the game, and this one doesn't have it, unfortunately. Next up at level 9 is the Hook, and it receives a D rating and a 2-star firepower rating. It has an overall speed of 9, 10,000 hull points, and requires 500 premium tokens to purchase. Keep all those in mind, as they will all factor into what I'm about to say. This is one of 2 ships that received a lot of criticism before our review. The most common theme was that we weren't testing it right, and I will just say up front that we definitely disagree with this. This is a ship where the on-paper statistics tell a different story than how players are actually using it in-game. On paper, this is a ship that has a 2 heavy cannon broadside on 3 of its 4 sides. In a world where level 9 ships can sport 4 heavy cannon broadsides, and level 10 will even see this go up to 5 or 6 cannon broadsides, you will clearly be outclassed. But where the ship does well is in chasing. It's one of the only ships that can mount its broadside in the chaser position, and that makes it good in this capacity. The Hook benefits from a concept known as threat, sometimes referred to as TTI in our past videos. Now, this is a topic that's really for another video, as it's part of our privateering ratings, not our combat ratings, but since so many of you requested that we do a deep dive on this, here's a quick synopsis of the concept. Threat is the potential of something happening, not necessarily that it will happen. In this case, it's the threat of the Hook sinking you and your ship while you are being chased. For the Hook, this only works against ships that are slower than it, which will be most trade ships, but not all of them. Examples are high-level ones like the Demeter and the Ceres, which are faster. In fact, we already talked about the impact of the Hook on the Albatross, which is its most likely opponent at this point in the game, but that review was part of the Albatross review in a past video. But in short, the hook wins if it is successful in threatening its opponent. This usually leads to them making tactical mistakes or in the threat becoming an actual outcome, such as sinking the ship. For example, convincing a ship that he can't get to a safe zone before your heavy cannons will sink him, so he veers off to engage you, and at this point, you've won. But threat isn't what we are modeling in these tests, and our rules of engagement are meant to specifically prevent fear from factoring into the Helmer's decisions. That's because this is a method of human intimidation that doesn't apply in a statistical matchup. We aren't allowing ships to run away either unless it's for specific parts of the test, such as a steamship using its engines as an advantage to reposition an offensive maneuver, which means the hook is being forced to engage in unfavorable broadside conditions in cases that normal players would simply disengage and go pick other targets. The other thing to say about the hook is it does very well in combat missions. The AI doesn't maneuver like a human, constantly attempting to move into a superior position the way a human would, but instead, it might not even know what a superior position is. It's simply engaging you and forcing damage through attrition. The hook does very well in this regard, and for the same reasons that it does well in threatening other human players. But all that said, as a combat ship, this ship should never make it into a line of battle, which honestly is what makes a good combat ship at level 9 and beyond, and that's in addition to the fact that because it requires premium tokens, it's overpriced in comparison to some of its contemporaries. So this ship has value if you get it, but if you find yourself in a position where you either can't afford it or picked another ship over this one at level 9, I wouldn't beat yourself up too hard over your decision. After all, at level 9 you really should be eyeing the ships that are coming in level 10 instead of focusing on these. But if you did choose to get it, then you should be able to outperform its on-paper statistics with enough practice. Just try to avoid getting outclassed by more powerful ships with heavier broadsides. The next ship is the Phoenix. We once called this the battle cruiser of the Grand Isles, and it was an S-tier ship. However, earlier this year, the developers did a re-baselining of combat ships to narrow down the differences between the various ships, and the Phoenix took a huge hit in its overall performance. As a result, it is now a C-tier combat ship. The main change was the removal of the ship's 2 forward-facing mortars, which back then doubled as long-range chasers as well. This had the effect of making it next to impossible to flee from this ship in any circumstance, and the steam engine allowed it to disengage from heavier ships and fight them at range, if that was ideal in their specific scenario. But the mortars are gone now, and in its place are several variants that allow you to get somewhat close to the previous configuration, but still not good enough to make it back to the S-tier rating for combat ships. The Phoenix sports a 4-cannon broadside, maxing out at a DPS of just above 375. It was able to beat all ships at level 9 and lower and can compete against ships that are at level 10, winning around half of all the engagements against level 10 ships, but it is noticeably outclassed in cases where steam ships operated in a support capacity. That's because it mounts a 4-cannon broadside, which when paired with its steam engine gives it a unique advantage. The Interceptor variant, on the other hand, which is the closest available to its previous configuration, did not perform as well, and by that I mean slightly less well. Not enough to really be noticeable, but the problem became apparent when turret-based ironclads are considered, which can do much better in providing interceptor-level cover for your fleet of ships, rather than the Phoenix. So to summarize all that, the Phoenix gets an A- in war, a reflection of its continuing dominance over ships that are at or below its level, but it doesn't have the overwhelming value against its higher-level ships that we saw in its older iteration. The final level 9 ship is the Stiletto, which is one of the 3 galleons at level 9. The ship receives a D rating, obtaining a DPS of 263 with a 3-cannon broadside. 2 of its broadside cannons sit along the center line, but the 2, quote, forward-mounted cannons, unquote, are done so at an angle, which allows the broadside to have a larger effective range, in theory at least. In practice, the ship's crosswind performance turned out to be a limiting factor to the value of this. To draw some quick comparisons, the Tyrant at level 10 does the same kind of thing with its forward cannon, albeit at a lower level platform. The positioning this way allows you to hit an opponent without extending beyond a 45-degree turn, which is what most other ships need in order to turn their broadside against their opponent. And when you do that, that means that the ship that you're attacking is gaining distance on you, because you aren't going in the same direction as them anymore. But in the example of the Tyrant, This works on that ship because its superior speed means that they are keeping pace with their opponent, and they are only having to pivot around 20 to 30 degrees to hit them with their forward-mounted broadside cannon. And while this works on the Tyrant, and in theory works on the Stiletto, the truth is it struggles on the Stiletto, as it doesn't seem to have the same consistency in its crosswind performance that the Tyrant does. Meaning, the distance your opponent is gaining on you is not worth the additional DPS you gain by using this cannon in the same way. This ship would probably have done very well in a statistical matchup if it had junk rigging. In that case, the angled approach would allow you to maintain a constant speed, and thus forcing your opponent to engage you instead of maneuvering away from you or into a position where you can't respond. This ship is summarized as the Marauder of the Galleons, but there are already so many ships that outperform this one that it's not worth buying unless you like the way that it looks. And in that category, the Stiletto is one of the most customizable ships in the game, so it is worth getting for that purpose if that's your thing. Now we make our way into level 10, and the first one alphabetically is the Binglehopper. This is currently the best ironclad in the game in terms of raw combat performance. It receives a 3-star firepower rating in our tests and a DPS of 555. It's worth noting that the highest DPS of any ship obtained at level 9 or lower was 440 DPS, so this is a solid 25% better than any other ship that you had available to you before you reached level 10. And to top it off, it sports 27,000 hit points, meaning it is able to maintain that level of DPS for a longer duration in the battle. And because it has turrets, it means that you should be able to sustain the DPS number at or near that maximum amount for as long as the ship is engaged. That makes the Binglehopper a great support ship because it's able to maintain its firepower at a full 360 degrees. Meaning if it was in the middle of multiple warships, it can switch the vector it's supporting and do so rapidly, instead of having to make wide turns to do so, as an example of the Alliance, which would have to turn to put its broadside forward. To emphasize the power of the Bingle, it's also worth pointing out its weight class, and that means other ships that it's actually meant to compete against. For that, let's look at how the Bingle appeared in roleplays, specifically the Pershovian War roleplay, which was going on earlier this year. And during that time, it was often used as the counter to the Ares, which is a 3-turreted ironclad that is specific to Pershovia. Now, in these matchups, the Bingles were crushed, but it is still a signal of how powerful these ships are and who they were meant to go up against. They aren't competing with middling combat ships, such as those with 4 or 5 cannon broadsides. The Bingle is contending for the spot as one of the top combat ships in the game. Said another way, the only ships that really compete with the Binglehopper in our side-by-side matchups was the Prometheus, Neptune, Alliance, and of course other Bingles. This doesn't factor in the Hind, which will also give you a run for your money, but also remember that the Bingle can be fully manned with just a crew of 4 people. That is, 2 on the turrets, a helmer, and at least 1 person manning the cannons in front. This means that most of your opponents will be trying to board you, but at the same time, pickup groups are much easier to form and make into a decent crew on a Bingle, unlike the Alliance or Hind, which are nigh impossible on public servers without some pre-planning. Now, all of this performance comes at a price though. If you consider all the materials needed, its advanced engine included, the price tag is a whopping 2.8 million in doubloons and materials. The only ships that cost more are the Ceres and the Demeter, which means that you are paying a lot of money to have the best combat ship in the game. Which means it's not recommended for your first level 10 ship unless you plan to stop playing the game here. Most people may not even have enough money to buy one of these once it's first available to them, but if you ever are wondering if this is a good ship to buy, well, for combat, yes it is. So with that, the price tag is the only thing that prevents this ship from hitting the S tier, and for that it'll remain in the A tier, but if you can afford it, the ship carries the firepower and versatility to make it a worthwhile purchase. Next at level 10 is the Chimera. This is a mortar ship sporting 2 medium mortars in the chaser position, a 4-cannon broadside, and decent maneuverability. The ship had a 524 DPS during our tests and is one of the best support ships in the game, and hands down the best mortar ship in the game. Don't be misled by the A- rating in the support category. We don't grade on a curve. That is purely due to how the statistics landed. The only ships that did better were the Prometheus, Brigand, and Alliance. All ships that if you're using them in a full-time support role, you're probably doing something wrong. And the Brigand and the Alliance aren't even available to you until level 12 anyway. If you desire to be a mortar specialist, this is pretty much a must-have in your inventory. The ship is on the expensive side though, costing 425,000 in doubloons and materials, not including the mortar that you also have to buy as well. But it is still cheaper than most other warships that are available at level 10 and above, which in some cases cost over 1 million doubloons. And there is a chance that you will use this extensively, especially if you are into mortaring. It's a common feature in roleplays, and there's a good reason for it. The forward-facing mortars make it the highest damage-dealing mortar in the game. It's even higher than most players will even realize because of the fact that there are 2 mortars on that front position, meaning your total damage over time is actually higher than what your mortar damage output would be alone. To understand this, we have to understand how hit probability works. And I won't go through all of the probability steps, but essentially, if you assume that you can hit with your mortar 40% of the time, that means you are dealing 2/3 of your mortar's maximum damage over time, rather than the 40% that you would get if you were doing it alone. And we can even verify this by looking at the output you would get in a Kestrel and a Fox, which have the same type of mortar but in a single configuration. And from our tests, we believe that the base damage output for 2 medium mortars appears to be higher than a single heavy mortar as well. When you add the extra damage from this probability phenomenon, the damage in this tandem configuration on the Chimera outperforms a heavy mortar even more. And all of this is just theory and on paper, of course, but then we actually tested it and found this to be true. Moreover, mortars have a higher level of disabling capability, meaning for each hit you are likely damaging your opponent even more than what we can actually show on paper. Plus, we saw a damage over time from the mortars to be around 150 DPS in the Chimera, compared to our Manta mortar test, which had a heavy mortar, came in at 49.2 DPS. So 2 mortars in this configuration are nearly 3 times the output that you get from a Manta. So in summary, this ship has a definite and measurable impact on the outcome of engagements where it is in a support role, and it was able to do so consistently. Even in direct combat roles, it was able to hold its own in most combat situations. This ship is a solid A tier, a ship that you should absolutely get if mortaring is your Tradelands career goal. Next is the Corsair. This is a junk-rigged ship available at level 10, recording a 2-star firepower rating and has 3 cannon, medium broadsides, and chasers. On paper, it wasn't too impressive, and its actual combat tests didn't fare much better either. This ship is better than it was back when we gave it a poor performance review during our Albatross test, but it has since received a fix to its sailing characteristics, which is supposed to make it a good interceptor. Unfortunately, there are 2 other ships available that now make this largely obsolete. The first one is the Kirin, which is also junk-rigged. It has a large broadside and sports chasers on one of its configurations. The other ship is the Ibis, which is available at level 8 and can largely mirror the statistics of the Corsair, meaning you are essentially buying a less versatile version of the Ibis when you purchase the Corsair. It's also worth noting that both the Kirin and the Ibis are cheaper to purchase as well, with the total cost to build the Corsair coming in at around 351,000 in doubloons and materials. One of the disappointing outcomes that we witnessed was its battle against the Serpent, which is a lower-level junk trading ship, something that it should easily be able to handle. But this engagement became a series of long, loopy battles, owing to the fact that the Corsair could only get a maneuverability bonus of about 1/3 better than the maneuverability of the Serpent. This is in stark contrast to other privateers like the Ibis, which were over twice as maneuverable as the Corsair and over 2/3 faster in maneuverability rating than the Serpent in this exact same test. For what it's worth, anything under 1/2 of a bonus means that your maneuverability is difficult to use, because you're not fast enough to keep your opponent's most effective side off of you, usually their broadside, and at the same time you can continue hitting them, either with chasers or your own broadside. This means that the Serpent won against the Corsair because it was able to place enough of its broadside hits on the Corsair to make up for any deficiencies that the Corsair created with its maneuverability, whereas the Ibis, Marauder, and others easily outpaced the Serpent's broadside, and that's why they were able to win the same type of engagement. This is only one example, of course, because they're both junk ships, but this happened nearly every time we tested the Corsair against any ship. It turns like the Tyrant, but without the broadside the Tyrant has to make that actually count. To drive this point home, going to the shipwright and doing a side-by-side comparison reveals that the default configuration between the Corsair and the Ibis are identical in some cases. In some cases, the Ibis is actually even better. And we just talked about maneuverability, but sail speed is the same. The Ibis has more hull points, the same armament, unless you consider those swivels armament, of course. The Corsair gets the advantage of 4 extra cargo, but the Ibis gets variance. And one of those is the Caro broadside, which coupled with the Ibis's maneuverability gives it a combat advantage you can't replicate in a Corsair. So that said, the Corsair received a D rating in our matchups. It wasn't able to outperform its competitors consistently, even lower level ones, and doesn't give a good ROI for the cost it requires to build. The next is the level 10 Grouse. This is one of the few ships that sports a rear heavy cannon. Actually, it has 2 of those. It receives a 2-star firepower rating and is one of the most iconic ships in Tradelands following its release last year. The ship is well known for its strength as a trader and is often seen on the Triangle trade route. It is a rock, paper, scissors type ship, meaning it is meant to be the direct counter to privateering ships while performing poorly as an all-around combat ship. This is the role it largely does very well. The rear cannons mean that you will usually be going up against pirates that are hitting you with light chasers. And that usually becomes a 2v2 matchup, meaning your 2 cannons versus their 2 cannons, and in this case you will be dealing a lot more damage to your opponent than they will be doing to you. Moreover, the Grouse has a downwind speed of 9, so some ships will actually have difficulty turning their broadside on you. In a pre-test statistical matchup, on paper the biggest threat to the Grouse was shown to be the Hook, which also sports 2 heavy chaser cannons. But in the actual tests themselves, this was no contest. The Grouse won every time. In a review, it's because the Grouse sports over 16,000 hull points where the Hook only had 10,000, meaning the Grouse was simply winning through attrition. This was an interesting find, actually. In short, we found that the ship performed best when it actually baited enemies to chasing it, and then using attrition to just repeatedly win these engagements once it happened. Ships that fared well against the Grouse were those with long-range chasers, such as those with forward-mounted mortars, ships that had more hull points and could stand up to the punishment those rear cannons were giving, and ships that were faster than the Grouse. They simply maneuvered into its blind spot in front of them, or if they had the ability to go toe-to-toe, 3-cannon broadside versus whatever they had, and win, they would do that instead. So this ship is a decent combat ship. Be aware, however, that there is a brother ship to the Grouse, and it's called the Termagant, and that is an actual combat version of the Grouse, so don't get confused. Still, despite all this, don't forget that this is a trade ship, and trying to rock this in a line of battle or something will get you sunk. But it does hold its own within a specialized field, and that is a ship meant to deter piracy and convince pursuers to chase other targets. And for that, it receives a B+ rating. Learn how to use its rear cannons to maximum effect, but avoid any serious broadside-to-broadside battles because that will most likely get you sunk in the end. Next at level 10 is the Kirin. This is a junk-rigged ship with 5-cannon broadside and a 3-star firepower rating. It performs very well in combat, able to stand up to all but the most combat-worthy ships in the game. It also has the same cargo hold size as the Grouse, meaning if you are looking for a true multi-purpose ship, then the Kirin is the one you want. This ship is often featured in roleplay events, and that's an important thing to call out here. It means that its versatility is well known to other players. The main advantage this ship gets is because it can fill multiple roles and it can do it well. On trade runs, its crosswind capability allows you to take paths that other ships cannot. In combat, it's usually given a specialist role because it carries a higher crew complement and has a covered deck, meaning you can expect it to protect its passengers and give longer life to your cannon crew because the cannons are also harder to snipe. And on the topic of cannons, its 5-cannon broadside and 20,500 hull strength means it can be attached to a line of battle and actually perform its duties to nearly the same level as a dedicated ship of the line. The Brawler variant allows you to attach heavier cannons, but its base allows you to attach chasers at the expense of some broadside power. In a fleet engagement, this setup gives better support characteristics, which is what you see in its B rating in the support category. But if you are planning to go brute strength against brute strength, the Brawler variant did much better, where you are essentially using your high hull points to dish out damage for longer periods of time. Overall, this is a good ship to buy. It's one of the few late game ships that give a positive ROI in combat, but its versatility in trading as well and its usefulness in some quasi-pirating activities such as in a mothership means it's a good pick at level 10. You will likely use this ship once you have it because it adds value to nearly every situation you will encounter, even if it may not be the best in that specific category. It receives a total grade of an A, but its high marks across the board make it a solid choice and a recommended buy. The next ship is an interesting one, the Kraken, a ship from a bygone era of Tradelands where overpowered ships easily outclassed their counterparts. The Kraken is an S-tier ship with a 3-star firepower rating. You might be scratching your head right now about how a 3-star rating can get you S-tier at level 10, and here's why. I'm just going to read its stats here. It has 6 heavy cannons, effectively a 3-cannon broadside. It carries 2 medium mortars and 2 bow chasers. All of this on a junk-rigged ship, meaning it's one of the only junk ships that have a mortar, with a speed of 8 and hull strength of 17,500 hit points. No ship under level 10 was able to touch the Kraken, and against those that could actually compete against it, only the Prometheus, Pigeon, Neptune, Binglehopper, and Alliance were able to do so consistently. That's a pretty elite group to be a part of. Made even more impressive when you consider the cost to build the Kraken. The Kraken has a cost of $285,000 in doubloons and materials, and that's including the voucher cost, by the way. Every ship on that last list that I just read out to you cost over 1 million doubloons and materials to buy. So you are able to do some considerable damage at a fraction of the cost it would cost you to do it otherwise. And if that's not a fearsome charge as to why you should build a Kraken, then I don't really know what is. Now, the ship's greatest downside is it is considerably poor at maneuverability, something we easily saw in our matchups, especially when steamships would lock onto it, and it was pretty much over at that point. It's also entirely possible that we missed something here because I don't see this ship on public servers very much, and given how much higher this ship's performance was compared to others, I would expect to see it everywhere, especially considering how cheap the voucher is, especially when you get it directly from the Harrisburg merchant, but it's also pretty cheap on the market. In addition, this ship performs very well in a support role. It influenced the outcome of about 56% of all engagements, and it earns a B+ rating on this chart. The elevated position of the guns made it easier to shoot at long range, but we were not able to put the ship in a stationary position due to some noticeable blind spots. Anyway, to conclude, in raw firepower, the Kraken was one of our best performers, earning an S-tier rating. We found the ship to be worth the cost to buy, and performs well in fleet-style actions against opposing ships. The next ship is the level 10 Mastiff. It is a B-tier ship with a 3-star firepower rating. That's a noticeably good score for a dedicated trade ship. That's because the Mastiff is in a line of trade ships that trade additional cargo capacity for better broadside capability. It will go on to be a feature in the Mule and later in the Camel. The roots of this decision can actually be traced to another ship, the Atlas, which until very recently actually had identical stats to the Mastiff, with the key difference being that the Mastiff has a tighter hull, an important advantage for trading in Tradelands because some ports are literally too big for the Atlas to actually trade in. But this isn't about trade, this is about combat performance. We compared this ship to the Marlin actually, and what we mean by that is we compared how the Marlin compared against ships at or below its level to that of the Mastiff against ships at level 10, which is its level or lower. Remember that the Marlin was in a category where other combat ships were seeing a considerable jump in capability, and the Mastiff is experiencing that here at level 10 as well. And unfortunately, the Mastiff doesn't outperform some of the other trade options that are available at level 10, not in combat anyway. Take the Kirin as the example. They both sport about the same broadside capability, with the Kirin having chasers that it can swap out due to its variant to have heavier broadsides instead. The Mastiff doesn't have this and instead has a flat 2,000 extra hull points, but let's put that in perspective here. What does 2,000 hull points actually get you in a line of battle? 1. It gets you literally a 1, and I mean 1 broadside. In our test, that's about 8 seconds of additional lifetime. That's because at level 10, ships have a maximum broadside somewhere between 2,300 and 3,000 damage per broadside. At least that's what we saw in our test. And assuming that those were all hits, of course, you do have to be pretty close in order to achieve those kinds of results. Now, granted, this is an extreme case, but hopefully you're getting the gist of where I'm going here. Minor hull point differences mean very little at this point in the game. A 1,000 difference means a lot at level 5, where all the ships in the game have around 5,000 hit points. That's a little 25% increase in your lifespan. But when ships are averaging 20,000 hull points or more, your 2,000 additional hull points mean next to nothing. So from a raw performance standpoint, the 5-cannon broadside does give it some decent output, so the Mastiff receives a B rating here. But the Kirin, which also sports similar output, is actually an A-rated ship. So if you can afford the additional cost of acquiring that ship, I would recommend eyeing the Kirin and view the Mastiff as a secondary option. Next up is the Mercury. This was a new addition to the list of ironclad warships this year. It has the lowest firepower rating of the ironclads at 1 star, and should be viewed as more of an introduction to the ironclad warships category rather than a new addition meant to supplant the best of this class. And to that end, the Mercury does its job. It's cheaper than the Poseidon, which previously held this honorary title. Moreover, it doesn't sport any turrets, meaning you can use it with whatever hardware you already have. Its lowly 2-cannon broadside is decent at causing damage at long range, but many players have already learned that its weakness is to just get in close. Sniping off 2 sides of this ship, effectively 3 cannons in total, effectively pacifies it completely. In most cases, if this happens to a warship, the crew would simply board the opposing ship, but the Mercury was meant to work with a crew of just 2 or 3, and that means you typically can't do this. The ship performs best against slower opponents that weren't able to close the distance on it. The low profile in the water makes it harder to hit without training. We will be the first to admit we got better at fighting this ship as time went on, leading to cases where our numbers may have been skewed by this fact. But the Mercury isn't meant to win major battles. It's a cool looking ship. Frankly, it looks amazing when cladified. Every component of its outer appearance can be customized, and it has a figurehead that allows you to do even more customizations to it. So build this ship for the fact that it is a cheap introductory ship to the Ironclad family, not because you are attempting to threaten the Binglehopper in a 1v1 combat for the top slot. The next is the Neptune, one of the top tier ironclads in the game. The ship receives an A rating, essentially the same level as the Binglehopper, and performed very well in its combat matchups, earning a war rating in the S tier. Like the Binglehopper, it is a solid support ship, obtaining a B+ rating. Now this isn't actually a ship. It's a single massive turret with a ship built around it. The one that seems to perform the best is the Carronade turret. In our best case, that turret and its subsequent broadside was able to deliver 379 damage per second. If it has a support ship protecting it on its exposed backside, this was able to deliver that damage consistently over time, whereas most ships attempted to go around the large turret, causing some difficult maneuvering to be required, which limited its effectiveness in maintaining continuous results. That said, this ship easily outperformed our expected results. We view the Ironclads as a sort of sub-tier of level 10 ships that are meant to compete on their own playing field, one in which wind doesn't factor in at all. But if you consider the 4 ships in a linear path, where they all are a steady improvement on a lower tier counterpart, then this ship outperforms expectations handedly. That's because it was able to match similar support effectiveness as the Binglehopper. The ships that gave the Neptune a serious run for their money was the Prometheus and the Alliance. And other than those two, we noticed that crosswind capability was the #1 factor with other ships that made you competitive against the Neptune, especially when you couldn't match it in raw firepower. This of course may be just a product of how we conduct our tests. For example, any steamship that can outrun the Neptune would ultimately win against it, as the Neptune just can't catch up, and then it's a choice of turret type that determines what happens next. But this maneuver wasn't allowed in our tests, if for no other reason than I didn't want to spend an entire day kiting it in a Demeter, popping off random shots every 5 minutes, which is exactly what I would have done if I was going up against the Neptune. But really, to summarize the Neptune, if the cost of the Binglehopper is out of reach for you, then the Neptune is a very safe alternative. It's also expensive though, so don't expect that to factor into it much. If you are curious to know which one wins between the Neptune and the Bingle in a head-to-head matchup, well, the Bingle did by 2 percentage points, which is well within a reasonable margin of error. So really, it's dead even, especially after you consider the cost differences between these two ships. But against other sailing ships, those are non-ironclad ships, then the Neptune is an excellent choice to buy. The Osprey is a level 10 ship that sports a 6-cannon broadside on a low open-air deck. It has a 3-star firepower rating and is one of the most iconic ships in Tradelands due to its importance to the game's lore. The sister ship of the Osprey is the Retaliator, and the two of them have nearly identical performance characteristics. Overall, the Osprey is a strong combat ship. It has 17,000 hull points and 12 heavy cannons, and costs only 344,000 in doubloons and materials. That makes it the cheapest 6-cannon broadside ship in the game, with the Retaliator 5,000 doubloons more than this, and the next closest contender is the Pigeon and the Sigil, which cost over 800,000, so those are 2 to 3 times as much. The ship isn't without its deficiencies though. Its open hull makes it vulnerable to mortar fire and disabling, and it has square sails, which in practice limits its ability to maneuver in certain circumstances. When in a support role, however, which limits the impact of these deficiencies, the Osprey shines quite well. And it's worth noting that the high side walls offer gunners some protection from direct fire, although not much from experienced gunnery crews who know how to get around this. But all in all, the Osprey is an A-tier ship. It's cost effective and it provides good fleet support and will do just fine in a line of battle. Another way to view this ship is as a variant of the Tyrant, where you are trading the Tyrant's cargo capacity for 4 additional cannons and 7,000 extra hull points. And to that end, there is a cautionary note to make here. If you see an Osprey coming at you, it's not coming to take a look at your cargo, it's coming to sink you. So you better figure out your fight or flight plan quickly, because at speed 9, you won't have a lot of time to decide. And finally, we rate this ship as an A today, but following the progression of updates that we see from the developers, it's likely to be on its way to a remodel soon. We will update the stats when it does, but personally, we do like the blocky, almost industrious features of this ship. It gives a unique, almost chine-like hull design to it, and that provides character to this ship and fits well with the nation that it represents. Next up is the Pigeon, which is the ship of the line at level 10, and by that I mean that it sports a 9-cannon broadside, which is the most you will find on any ship at level 10 or lower. However, these are all light cannons, so you will need a gunnery crew that is capable of firing at accuracy to really make these cannons count. It has 20,000 hull points, which means it can hold up in a line of battle, where 20,000 hull points are usually the requirement in order to stand up against the broadsides of more powerful ships for the duration required to be in a line of battle. And because of this, it is listed as a B-tier ship. But don't let that mislead you. We were able to pull a DPS of around 500 to 600 consistently, meaning that this is one of the only 4-star ships in the game, making it part of a very elite group of warships, as many just can't sport this level of firepower on a single ship. Its contenders at this level are the Osprey, the Retaliator, the Sigil, Alliance, and Brigand. Because of its large broadside, it also works well in a support capacity, but that isn't how most players will be using this ship. You will be using it in a line of battle, mostly. Also, it has high crew requirements, that is, in order to reach the highest level of firepower ability. It's also not the most powerful ship of line available to players at the end of the game, so that's why it receives a B rating instead of an A. But that can be misleading if you are trying to compare this to other B-grade ships from lower levels. Again, it's up against a much higher bar of contenders, and is receiving a B rating against them, not others like the Shark or the Orca as an example. Because the Osprey and the Retaliator are able to offer better comparable firepower owing to their use of heavier guns at lower prices, actually at nearly half the price of the Pigeon, the ship is an F in terms of overall value. And because of its relatively slow speed of 8, you can pretty much dismiss those 2 chaser cannons, as you'd only be using them if your opponent had made a mistake. It means they didn't add any value to the support value that you see listed as an A- on the screen. That came from its high hull, acting as a hull shield while providing a zone of control for your fleet to use to your advantage when planning your strategy in multi-ship engagements. The next ship is a fan favorite, the Poseidon. This is a level 10 ironclad that has 2 turrets and, well, That's it. It's a turret ship, with 360 degrees of protection and 18,000 hull points. It's part of the progression of ironclads at level 10, and this was the entry-level ironclad before the Mercury was added earlier this year, and now it's a middle-tier ironclad, sitting between the Neptune and the Mercury. In terms of combat, the turret offers a unique style of battle that you can only get from more expensive ships, and the Poseidon actually has 2 of these turrets, not 1. However, it's relatively weak because of these 2 turrets, with a 2-star firepower rating, which was the best we could muster in our tests. It has a speed 7 engine, so it's able to hunt down nearly every ship in the game when going upwind, and the 360 degree coverage means that maneuverability isn't really a concern once you have engaged your enemy. But the ship's firepower wasn't able to have the impact we expected in a support role, which is probably going to be a very controversial statement to make, given its notoriety as a support ship by most players. Instead, this ship works best when it is used as a skirmisher. That's when it operates independently of the main body and attempts to outflank its opponents and attack them from different angles. Whenever we forced this ship to go up in a broadside-to-broadside battle, it was typically on the losing end. It was even worse if its opponent had a higher crew complement, since the Poseidon usually carries a crew of 3, meaning it was at risk for being boarded anytime that we got too close. But that said, it received a C rating on our charts. This isn't surprising. Given that the Mercury was a D and the Bingle was an A, that's right in line with the progression of the ironclads, with the Neptune being the one single outlier that overperformed on this chart. Next at level 10 is the Prometheus. Last year we mentioned that this ship wasn't worth buying as a combat ship, and that was a product of the time when we reviewed it. It was never because we thought it wasn't good in combat. We just thought it was too expensive, and it didn't seem necessary. But since then, there has been a re-baselining of all the combat ships and their capabilities, causing a difference in the combat characteristics to be narrower. Moreover, several new and very expensive ships were added to the game, which nullify the cost of the Prometheus, which sat at over 1 million in doubloons and materials, with only a small handful of ships costing more at that specific time. But since that review, we've had the addition of the Ceres, the Albatross, the Mercury, and most recently the Brigand, which has upended this field completely, especially in terms of cost. And while the Prometheus still receives an F rating in value, it's more like a 50% F rating versus the 10% F rating we were giving it last time. And if you think about the kind of impact that percentage change would have on a ship that would otherwise be getting an A in combat, it really comes down to the difference between getting a B rating or a D- overall rating. Now consider the rebaselining of combat stats for the players in the field of this type of ship combat, and consider that the Prometheus has received virtually no changes in this rebaselining. And to that end, here is what the Prometheus stats look like. It has 360 degree protection. It sports 2 forward-mounted mortars in chaser positions, a 6-cannon broadside, 3 heavy and 3 medium cannons, 2 stern guns, and a speed 8 with a steam engine, 20,000 hull points, and a cargo capacity of 10. There is no other ship in the game that can sport all of that firepower and hull strength on a single ship. It's virtually impenetrable. The only thing that will save you is your ability to outrun this ship, which isn't what our tests are measuring. It's measuring actual head-to-head combat. And so it should go without saying that this received an S-tier rating as a combat ship. Moreover, it was the only one to receive a full 5 stars of firepower at level 10. And it works in combat, it works as a support ship, it works against the tack-in, and it's essentially your battleship of the Grand Isles. And for that reason, if you wanted to buy just one ship at level 10 and make it count, the Prometheus can do it all for you. So this is the one to shoot for. But for how long this ship will stay in this S-tier category is hard to say. I mean, if the Phoenix can fall from its S-tier position in the way that it did, then the Prometheus can as well once the devs start eyeing it. So don't be too upset if this rating changes in the future. The next ship is the Termagant. I'm kind of breaking my own rules here by including it on this list since it's technically an exclusive ship, but it appears to be re-added to the shipwright on a regular interval, and that is every Birkeland Royal Games. So I decided to play a little loose with that rule and do a quick review anyway. This is essentially the same as the Grouse, but with some of its cargo capacity replaced with 4 additional cannons. That change effectively improves the ship from a 2-star firepower rating to a 3-star rating. This affords it the benefit that the Grouse does not have, and that is your ability to provide a 5-cannon broadside once your opponent has decided to stop chasing you. And therein lies the strategy that seems to work best with this ship. It's the same strategy that we suggested with the Grouse. It's different in the sense that you want to bait ships into chasing you. Doing so effectively gives you the initiative in the battle, whereas usually the chaser is the one that has this advantage. The slower turn rate and square sails do put you at a tactical disadvantage though, meaning you will likely underperform the ship's statistics until you've learned how to master this ship's heavy stern cannons, which aren't going to be as effective as the Grouse in baiting pirates to follow you, simply because you are not as lucrative of a boarding target owing to the lower cargo capacity that your ship has. So as a result, it is rated as a B in combat. Use its unique feature of a rear-facing heavy cannon to its maximum effect. But if this is not your style of fighting, it's probably best to pick another ship at this level that better suits you. The next level 10 ship is the Retaliator, and this is likely to be a controversial review. So I will once again reiterate that this is a statistical review, not a subjective one. The Retaliator is the sister ship to the Osprey, both having a long and storied history in Tradelands lore, but while the Osprey is an A-tier ship, the Retaliator is an S-tier ship. This, by the way, is a difference of 5 percentage points. So if you're concerned that I'm saying that this one is way better than the Osprey, I will repeat that. I said 5 percentage points difference. This was a bit confusing at first because I honestly expected that both the Osprey and the Retaliator would come out nearly identical. After all, on the surface they both have 6 cannon broadsides. The Osprey has a sidewall for protection and 500 extra hull points, but in our actual tests, the one advantage the Retaliator had was in fact that it had lateen or crosswind sails, allowing it to have a slightly better maneuverability, and that was consistently better in combat performance. The 6-cannon broadside gave it a 3-star firepower rating, with 560 DPS being the highest we were able to record. But we found the ship was slightly harder to hit as well, owing to the fact that it has a thin and very low hull. The best way to attack this ship was actually with mortars, but because it's fast, most gunners had a hard time aiming at it properly. And since it already had a remodel earlier this year, this is likely to be what the Retaliator's stats will end up being for the time being. While this is hardly anything more than anecdotal, I will point out that the Retaliator is a common ship in roleplays, and I've also seen a lot fewer Ospreys in those roleplays. That might just be due to the volume of White Crest-oriented battles, but it does show that their faction does have faith in the ship's performance, and I don't see a lot of captains using ships that they don't think are capable in combat, at least in roleplays. So take that as a vote of confidence that the Retaliator is a very good choice to buy. It's an S-tier ship based on our combat statistics that we gathered. It's also a very cost-effective option compared to the Pigeon and other ships that have larger broadsides. It's very maneuverable, enough to work in a support role as well as in a line of battle, and in fact, it's usually working independently due to its superior maneuverability, rather than being forced into a line of battle where its maneuverability would be muted. Next up is the Sigil, a level 10 ship of the line. It's often regarded as the poor man's alliance, likely due to its similar but more compact features and the fact that it carries a heavy broadside. This ship is a 3-star firepower rated ship, and it has a brawler variant, which allows you to convert your medium cannon broadside into a heavy cannon broadside. This is a recommended upgrade if you are using this for a ship of the line. That's because in a line of battle, and I mean pretty much by definition here, you are attempting to line up all of your heaviest broadsides into a single powerful wall of fire. The chasers do nothing in this regard unless you are in the frontmost position of your line. Now, assuming you aren't that lead ship in the line, your objective in this case is to do the same thing you would do in an alliance. Get your enemy into range and pound them to dust. At 18,500 hull points, it's on the lighter side. You really want 20,000 hull points or more to be in a line of battle, so it's not going to be able to take a beating forever, and despite appearances on the outside, the ship's gunnery crew are vulnerable to plunging fire, although this wasn't a strategy that worked consistently in our tests. But the Sigil has questionable value over some of the other ships that are available at this level. Its square sails and speed of 8 make it average, with 2 cheaper ships with similar broadsides, that being the Retaliator and the Osprey respectively, having similar hull points but greater speed. So at 812,000 in doubloons and materials, it has questionable value at level 10. If you can afford this ship, you may want to just save up and then buy an alliance at level 12, which is 1.6 million in doubloons and materials instead. I mean, you're already halfway there, and if you bought this ship, you'd be starting from 0. But in the end, we rate this ship as a B tier ship. It's a decent, if slightly weak-hulled ship of the line. It shouldn't be the lead vessel in your line of battle, but it's going to pack a punch in the number 2 or 3 slot. The next ship at level 10 is the Tyrant. Once listed as an A tier combat ship, it has been downgraded to a C tier ship. If you listened to the review of the Prometheus that we did earlier in this video, well, the same thing happened to the Tyrant, only this time it was in reverse. While the re-baselining of combat ships was good for the Prometheus, the Tyrant saw this leveling the playing field against it, with more powerful warships, some with even better maneuverability, and of course variants, enveloping its once solid position as the best combat ship. The Tyrant sports a 4-cannon broadside. The forward cannons are mounted at an angle, allowing it to chase opponents indirectly, but all of this wasn't able to move it beyond a 2-star firepower rating, and at this level, that kind of broadside doesn't pair well with its 10,500 hull points. These stats make it sort of a level 9 ship rather than a level 10 ship, and its once superior value to cost took a hit as well with the introduction of the Ibis at level 8. Consider this comparison. The Ibis costs 240,000, the Tyrant costs around 200,000. They both have the same speed, they both carry a 4 heavy cannon broadside, albeit the Ibis is carronades only, but the Tyrant having 10,500 hull points and the Ibis having 11,500 hull points means that its hull points to actually get in close enough to use those carronades is practical, and the Ibis is available 2 levels earlier, making that the better option. And then you have all the other ships, most of which can carry a 4 or more heavy cannon broadside, and in fact, in hindsight, it was the addition of the variants to these ships, not the new ships themselves, that really caused the Tyrant to lose its rating, because it didn't get combat marauding variants or any other intercepting type of variant added to its own model. So look at it as similar to what happened to the Phoenix. Just in this case, it wasn't a nerf to the ship. It was more like the devs upped the playing field around it, so the other players in the game could actually compete against it. Now we move into level 12. The first ship here is the Alliance, and to say this simply, this is the ship of the line in Tradelands. It's the one all other combat ships, outside of Ironclads of course, are measured up against. It has an 8 cannon broadside. It has a variant that allows you to make this an 8 heavy cannon broadside to become one of the most fearsome broadsides available in the game. And it's no surprise really that this ship receives a 5-star firepower rating and a near perfect war score, as it was able to beat or compete against every other ship in the game. However, this comes at a price. Once you factor in the material cost, it is over 1.6 million in doubloons and materials. But believe it or not, as expensive as that sounds, this is not the most expensive ship in the game. To name a few, the Neptune, Binglehopper, Ceres, and Demeter all cost more than the Alliance. Granted, however, that none of those ships require a 9-person crew, and that is what this ship needs to operate its full broadside while being fully maneuvered at a minimum. So I guess in a way you're exchanging the cost in doubloons for a cost in personnel. And that is an expensive ship in that case. And that might not make sense to you, but once you build this, try forming a 9-person pickup group on the White Crest docks to go in the battle, and it won't take you long to figure out just how hard that is and why you might prefer to pay a little more in your ship rather than one that has high crew cost. In other words, as fantastic as this ship is on paper, chances are you will never use its full potential on a public server, unless you are in a crew or a navy, which is where you will get the most use out of this ship actually. But as far as combat goes, and in our tests by the way, we assume fully manned crews, it competes in a very elite group. It pretty much defines the maximum firepower you can bring to a fight. And in a way, it limits how many ships your opponent can bring against you, and there can only be 2 or 4 fully manned alliances in a server, the difference in that number being how you interpret quote-unquote fully manned, be it 10 men or 20, so fights against an alliance are often against other alliances. Other than that, ships that did well against it were mortar ships, except the Griffin, which did not perform well. The Camel was pretty good, ironically, especially when it was kiting. By the way, mortar ships and the Camel, these matchups required near limitless time frames because of all the moving around the map. In a dead heat matchup, however, the Brigand, Gargoyle, Neptune, Binglehopper, and Poseidon were the 5 that were able to contend against it. And honestly, that's a pretty elite group to be matching up against. So that's the class of your contenders if you decide to shell out the cash and build this ship of the line. And with that, let's talk about the Brigand. This is one of the newest additions to the game. It is a level 12 ship of the line. It has 6 or 7 cannon broadside, depending on the variant you have, whether you have the standard or the elite version. But in either case, the ship proves to be an extremely maneuverable ship of the line, with a 9 speed Latine, meaning crosswind capable sailing characteristic, allowing it to do things that other ships cannot with its broadside. This ship being newer to the game means players still haven't quite figured out how to best use its characteristics. For example, its open deck means it's easy to disarm with mortars at range, but it is very capable of getting in close to other ships more comfortable than they are used to, and then attacking it from directions that other ships of the line cannot typically respond in. In fact, in our tests, it showed that this was an incredibly good support ship, giving it an A rating based on its performance characteristics when it was able to maneuver independently in the battle zone. And it sports a 4-star firepower rated broadside, and we are able to get this up to around 650 DPS, meaning we recommend using this ship in support roles in combat, despite its characteristics suggesting it should be used as a ship of the line. And by that I mean look at it like an advanced version of the Retaliator, instead of as a crosswind version of the Alliance. And when you do that, you should be able to get an A-tier performance out of the ship in combat as well. A competitive option in nearly every fight if you don't limit its strengths by forcing it to be shackled solely to the slow and lumbering line of battle. The next ship at level 12 is the Gargoyle. I'll be the first to admit that when we rated this ship last year, we really didn't do it justice. This ship was just released right before we started testing, and I personally only had a week and a half to test this ship before I had to rate it on a chart. And in hindsight, we missed a lot of features, and did a lot of guessing based on how we thought it would perform when we couldn't test it thoroughly. But that was then, and now we've had a chance to test this ship for a full year, and I can say it sits squarely in the B tier of combat ships. But we can't just end it there, because if you are really looking for a combat ship that you can actually use on public servers at level 12, then the Gargoyle is the one to buy. It is a 3-star rated firepower ship. It performs decent in combat, able to go up against nearly every ship at level 10 and lower, but struggles in head-to-head combat against the Alliance and the Brigand at level 12. But more importantly, it has a 5 heavy cannon broadside, meaning you can actually crew this ship on a public server, whereas other combat ships at level 12 are going to struggle with this. Moreover, if you were to do, say, a 6v6 matchup against the other level 12 ships, the Gargoyle will win. An undermanned alliance is nearly identical to the Gargoyle on-paper performance. The Gargoyle matches the Alliance in speed, hull points, and cannon sizes, but the Gargoyle was able to perform better in maneuvering. Assuming the gunnery is identical on both sides, the Gargoyle even edged it out slightly in firepower, but not in a statistically significant way. The Brigand fared better, but not by much. Moving in close, it was able to disarm the Gargoyle a bit easier than the Alliance did, but the swivels on the Gargoyle are not just for looks. And while they aren't factored into our tests in most cases, in this one, the Gargoyle used them effectively against the Brigand's crew. But I'll be honest, we're nitpicking here. The Gargoyle has a couple of other extreme values that make it a better purchase. Namely, it has a hauler variant, which effectively gives you the same trading stats as the Camel, a ship that isn't available for another 4 levels. And this upgrade can make the Camel completely redundant as a choice, really, and that's an immeasurable value, but it's not a combat one, it's still an important one. One curiosity that we noted about the Gargoyle is that the total damage over time, that's the number that's shown on our website, but I don't show it in this video. Maybe at the end I'll do a chart on it. That is the total damage it was able to do before it was ultimately sunk in its best case scenario. Ironically, we found that the hauler variant had more potential damage output than the base version of the Gargoyle, despite having weaker cannons and less hull points. After scratching our heads over this, we found the issue. The standard Gargoyle was actually sinking ships too fast, and it was limiting its total possible damage by being too good. And it turns out that for any ship that has a limit at or above 70k total damage over time, depending on how many hits you got in before the final volley was fired, that means it's actually at maximum damage output. And its total potential damage output is actually even higher than we were able to record. But we don't know by how much, and this affects multiple ships, and we really can't tell, because we literally can't spawn in enough ships to test it, since we're limited to servers that have a limit of 50 players per server. And some of those have to actually sit on the ship that we're testing and fire those cannons. So in short, the Gargoyle performs above peak performance as to what we were able to measure anyway, but the hauler variant is exceptionally good for what you get overall as well. And of course, when you are ready to switch the Gargoyle into combat mode, simply switch it to its combat variant and then you're good to go. We rated it as a B tier because you don't get both of these variants at the same time. You do have to switch them. And while it does technically have a weaker broadside than other ships at this level, the truth is on a public server, if that's where you're using it, you're likely to have an even better experience in a Gargoyle than you would in one of the level 12 alternatives. The next level 12 ship is the Griffin. It is a top tier mortar ship and it sports 2 heavy mortars instead of its closest companion, the level 10 Chimera, which has 2 medium mortars. This ship has a 4 cannon broadside and a distinct disadvantage, yes that's right, I said disadvantage, and that its 2 mortars cannot perform tandem firing. These are broadside mortars, which means they are firing to the side instead of forward of the ship. That means it's going to be a different type of mortaring than you're used to with other ships, and to understand why this is a disadvantage, you need to go and listen to what we said about the Chimera if you haven't already, and it has to do with this tandem probability and its impact on damage output. In short, the Chimera does more damage over time than the Griffin, and while I don't have the exact stats to prove it, I do believe that 2 medium mortars are actually doing more damage by themselves than a single heavy mortar does, which is just adding insult to injury really, because even if the 2 mediums got the same damage as 1 heavy mortar, the bonus you get in your hit to miss ratio means the Chimera does even more damage in that ship than you will get in a Griffin. And in our tests, the Chimera was at least 25% better in hit output, and that's not even factoring in damage, that's just hit output. In fact, I found it better to look at the Griffin not as a mortar ship, but instead as a ship of the line that trades 2 broadside cannons for a mortar cannon. And in that way, it's a 6 cannon broadside. The problem is you can't maximize your broadside output in a single volley, because in most cases, the mortar fires too far and the broadsides fire too close, meaning your overall output is suffering as well. I'm getting dangerously close into getting into the weeds on this ship, so let me just summarize it this way. This ship is best used in a tactic in which you form something called a slot. That's a strategy where you attempt to force your enemy to go into a specific path by making it too dangerous to move out of it. But this will have to be a circumstantial value for the Griffin, and experienced helmers will likely not care about this, especially if they've never even seen this strategy before, so they don't even know what you're trying to do. To make this an A-tier ship, one of 2 things could have happened. First, if the mortar ship had full range of rotation, that would have allowed it to bring 2 mortars to bear on 1 target. However, this would essentially make them into turrets. That means we would be talking about a different kind of ship altogether. The other option would have been to combine it with the mule. After all, looking at the shipwright, we can see that the ships share the same hull configuration. However, the underlying stats for these 2 ships are actually completely different, except for the fact that they're both Speed 8 ships. But for example, if the Griffin had ended up being a variant of the Mule, it would essentially be trading cargo capacity and part of its broadside to make a dedicated long-range broadside ship. An upgrade which would allow for some interesting choices for players, as opposite to the Gargoyle, which already has this capability through its 2 variants. Unfortunately, the Griffin was released before variants were a thing, so this isn't an option. And as a result, this is not a recommended choice above some of the other options that you have available at level 12. This is a B tier ship, and a challenging ship to outperform the Chimera, as well as compete against the Gargoyle, the other option that is a good pickup at level 12, which makes this a backup option, and likely something that you will get after you already have everything else you wanted to build. The final ship at level 12 is the Mule. This is a trade ship, but it has a 5 medium cannon broadside, which is good enough for a 2-star firepower rating. With 22,500 hull points, you are able to stay in a fight for longer than some lower level trade vessels, and its crosswind ability gives it some maneuverability, but in general, this is going to make you more resilient as a trade ship, not necessarily as a frontline fighter. Before the changes in how crewing works, pirates used to use this as a mothership, mainly because it has a good cargo hold, is defendable from counterattacks, and could go crosswind, meaning it could somewhat keep pace with its raiders. However, this is less common these days since you can't change up your crew when there's cargo on your board your ship anymore. But technically, it has the broadside and the hit points to be placed in a line of battle, and at a speed of 8, it will keep pace with other ships of the line. However, as a trade ship, the Gargoyle is able to outperform this in trade velocity, meaning you earn less in a Mule, and the Gargoyle has a variant with higher damage output as well. And that isn't even considering the Brigand, which also has capabilities in these same categories where the Mule competes. So, as a result, on paper, the Mule should be a capable ship, but against the other options available to you at level 12, it is overshadowed. It's disheartening, really, because we do really want to recommend the Mule. Its sleek design make it a beautiful ship to watch on the water. We just don't see it used that much anymore, and from a statistical point of view, there seems to be a good reason why. Next, we move into level 16. The first ship to review is the Albatross. This is currently the top trade ship in the game, but as a fighter, it does very poorly. It receives a D rating on our overall combat scores and a 1-star firepower rating. We did a deep dive review into the Albatross earlier this year, so I don't want to re-review everything that we said back then. Most of it still holds up even to this day. I will say that since that review, the ship has become even worse at combat, owing to a change in hull points which lowered its overall resilience. This was a good choice in our opinion, as you really don't want to give this ship, or its captain for that matter, any reason to think that it will be able to go toe-to-toe against another warship. Its greatest strength lies in its ability to flee combat, and even with the reduction in hull points, this plan of retreat is still the ideal option for this ship. Use its speed 9 and crosswind advantage to evade pirate ships that are attempting to engage you. There's only a small group of ships that can actually outpace you if you maneuver properly, and unfortunately those same ships that can are going to outclass you in gunnery anyway, so get yourself ready for a knife fight instead. But in conclusion, this is a D tier ship. It doesn't perform well against any high-level combat ships and shouldn't be a primary combat option. Use the Camel if that's your goal. Which of course brings us to the level 16 Camel. This ship garnered more feedback than any other ship on this list. A lot of players provided feedback on how we could improve our test to better capture the Camel's strengths, and I have to say I found the feedback invaluable. The main issue for most people was the importance of those raised stern cannons in the back that seemed as if we were not capturing them in our previous tests. So we made some changes and then we redid our tests specifically focusing on this, and we found in specific circumstances this does provide a bump in our combat numbers, to the tune of 4% to 6% improvement in combat performance overall. However, we want to be very cautious here. We are trying to remove the human element from our tests, and we are towing that line very closely here. The Camel is a ship where your individual experience will vary wildly. In role plays and in skirmishes where I've had the opportunity to record hit counts on the Camel, players familiar with the Camel can readily get a 90% hit rate or better. That's after you remove the range-finding shots, of course, which really don't count as aimed shots. But where it becomes difficult is for casual players, and this can fall as low as 40% in some cases. This screen shows an average crew's experience on a Camel. Most of these shots will go wide of their target or even over their target, owing to low experience in firing from elevated positions where the pitch and roll of the Camel in particular is an unfamiliar mechanic to them. In this specific case, despite having better crew and a heavier ship, they will get boarded and their cargo will get stolen. And again, this is going to be your typical experience. Doing reviews like this are hard. I mean, do we go with the most experienced and best in class examples when we measure combat performance? Or the cases of players who may be mounting this cannon in desperation and probably never even fired a cannon on a Camel before this very moment when they had no other choice? Or do we go with something in the middle? Really, there's no right or wrong answer here. It's just a choice that we have to make. And the choice we made was to force all combat results to assume a 75 to 85% hit rate and to make sure we captured all statisticals at reasonable intervals, and focusing on ships' typical performance rather than a maximum or minimum performance. And that's what you see here. The Camel came in as a B tier ship. It's a 3-star firepower rating. It has 6 medium cannon broadside, it has a speed 8, and it has decent maneuvering, and it has 24,000 hull points, which means it's dishing out a lot of broadside damage for a longer period of time than other ships. For what it's worth, there are only 2 ships lower level than the Camel that have more hull points, and that's of course the Neptune and the Binglehopper, both ironclads with very specific use cases. And the Camel was one of the ships that hit our cap for the testing of maximum firepower output, so we don't even know how much it can actually do. But we do know it means that you can dish out a lot of damage for sustained periods of time. Our DPS varied between 251 to just over 500 in our tests, and that's what you're likely getting if you bring the Camel into a line of battle. So in other words, this is a good combat ship. It's an A in terms of war, and at this point, by the way, war represents its ability to fight practically every other ship in the game, because this is level 16. So its ability to obtain high marks in this category is definitely a vote of confidence. So to summarize, this is the last broadside ship available in this leveling system, and it holds its own while also carrying a good cargo capacity. The only thing holding it back from being used as a cargo ship is the Gargoyle, which has nearly identical trade velocity at this point, and of course also the Albatross, which just outright beats it, but of course you're going to lose combat performance as a result. But I believe you still can't go wrong with the Camel. It performs very well, and is one of the reasons why we revamped our entire combat test to make sure that we were capturing just that. So if you're asking me, should you buy the Camel? Yes, you should buy the Camel. It's a very good ship at level 16. The next and final ship on our chart is the Ceres. It is a level 24 ship, meaning it's pretty much your endgame ship. It has 2 light cannons and 1 medium cannon, good enough for a 1-star firepower rating and an overall letter grade of D. The advantage of this ship is in its steam engine, which allows you to outmaneuver most opponents, and its high hull points mean that it is more forgiving if you make a mistake and happen to, say, maneuver into the broadside of your opponent or something. But there are numerous deficiencies that make this perform worse overall. Mainly, all of its cannons are in the open, and thus it can be disabled very easily. Moreover, the Helmer is in an elevated position, meaning he can be sniped very easily. During one of our tests, it was even demonstrated that you can use small arms to do this deed. We discounted that result obviously, but the point was taken. The ship is incredibly expensive. Where last year the Poseidon would have held the record as probably the worst cost to benefit ship in the game, that honor lies squarely with the Ceres now. It shows as a D- here. But that's owing to the immense playing field that is available at this point in the game. It misses an F rating by a fraction of a percent. But as I said in the deep dive review of the series, and I will say it again here, this is an end game ship. You build this to show everyone that you have reached the end game, and if that's what you're trying to do, there is probably no better ship to do that than this. It is a flexing ship. If you wanted to find a better flexing ship, you'd have to start including the exclusive and auction ships, which is a video for another day, maybe. And with that, there you have it, our full review of all the combat ships in Tradelands as of November 2023. So to conclude this video, let's look at some of the side-by-side comparisons for each ship. I'll start with the ones that I think everyone cares about most, and that's the overall firepower ratings. As we said in the introduction of this video, firepower is calculated in 2 ways, and then we apply the highest result. First is the total hull point value of the enemy ship, divided by the time it took us to sink that ship in seconds. That is calculated from the moment we landed our first hit to the point at which it sinks, and I've got a timer running while I do that, pausing at any point where the combat is actually disengaged. The second way is to record the loss in hit points a ship receives over the course of a minute, and then I divide by 60. This is an imperfect measurement, and I recognize that, but unless we get access to the exact stats for each ship, this is probably the best we can do for now. However, even if the point totals aren't exactly right, the important thing is that it gives us a benchmark to which we can compare all of these ships. And since we measure all of our ships the exact same way, it allows us to see how they perform side by side. So here is the list of all those ships side by side. The ranges you see on the screen show the highs and lows between a single side, usually a broadside, and a multi-vector attack. That means cases where we did these support tests and there were multiple targets, not just one that we could shoot at. The wider swings in this regard were the Binglehopper, Chimera, Neptune, Poseidon, and Prometheus, essentially all of your quote-unquote turret ships, or those that have wide angles of coverage. There are two humps in performance. One occurs at level 6 and the other occurs at level 10, where ships seem to perform above the standard progression curve for firepower. And your 600 plus DPS ships all occur at level 10 or higher. Our Elite Club, that will be the group of ships that perform the best in each category, had a total of 19 entries, all of them with a DPS over 500. And if you look at this chart, that's the Pigeon, Brigand, Alliance, and Prometheus all recording the highest total damage in our tests. Looking at broadside power only, that's the side of the ship that had the highest damage output. It's not necessarily a broadside, sometimes it's others. We see a similar trend in the overall firepower, with ships at and above level 10 rocketing above 500 DPS, where the Marlin, Orca, and Shark coming in at 300 DPS at their level. There seems to be a dip in combat performance between level 7 and 9, however, and then it peaks again at level 10, and ultimately we have one of the highest with the Alliance. The best in class in broadside power has 9 entries. These are essentially your ships of the line, and every single name on this list is worthy of carrying that title, and for good reason. Next, we look at the total damage over time. This is how long you can sustain your DPS before you are sunk or you run out of enemies to shoot at. This is essentially adding hull points to the equation, but it removes the maneuverability from the equation, because it's about maximum output, not how fast you are doing it. The chart shows how all of these match up. You can see the linear progression as you go farther to the right. It's worth noting that we found a hard cap at around 70,000 total damage. That's where our test stopped being reliable, due to a limitation where we literally cannot spawn in enough hit points to test the true maximum of these ships. The damage output shown above 71k is due to how many additional broadsides were able to be fired, not the actual total output. And to that end, the 70,000 limit defines our best in class. There are 21 ships in this class. Essentially, we are saying that with the right captain and crew, you should be able to sink every ship on the server with one of these things spawned. This test is arguably the most important in terms of identifying the best combat ship in the game, but the actual threshold for these ships is above what we can actually test at the moment. So we can't safely say one of these are better than another, because we actually don't know. But this is likely in the correct order based on our tests and what we think would happen if we did not have this cap. Still, this is a very elite group to be a part of, especially when you are on a public server where you may or may not know what ships you are going up against. Next up is winning percentages. This is the total number of combat matches that ships actually won, or tied, meaning both sunk each other at the same time. We do a weighted one called War, or Wins Against Replacements, where we match it against only ships that are at or below the ship's level, and then we do the total overall winning percentage against all the ships. The blue bar shows the weighted war value, the one that was shown on the individual ship ratings that we showed earlier in this video. The orange bar is the actual winning percentage against the full spectrum of ships it could go up against. Notice how the blue bar tapers and eventually disappears as we get closer and closer to the last level, that being 24, and that's because by that point in the game, they're actually the same measurement. Being above 60% on this list is good. That means you are winning 2/3 of all of your engagements. If we remove the war rating, because we covered that extensively already, and we look at just the overall winning percentage, the Badger and the Phoenix are the only two ships before level 10 that allow you to do that. And at level 10 with the Binglehopper, Neptune, and Prometheus, you should be able to beat most of the combat situations you find yourself in. Our elite best in class in this category has 9 entries. These are ships that have winning percentages over 90%. The Brigand and Griffin barely inched their way into this list. The Alliance was the hands down winner here, and both variants took the top slot. Then the Prometheus, Neptune, Binglehopper, Camel, and Pigeon round out the remaining ones in that order. Our next category is support. To be clear, to get points in this category, you have to influence the outcome of a battle. If a ship was already going to win easily without your involvement, or you are not able to stop the inevitable loss as the outcome, then you do not get credit in the support category for this matchup. As we see here, we don't have any ships that exceeded 70% support threshold until level 10. The Widgeon, Serpent, Otter, and Badger break 60%, but this is still a very elite category, and it's really focused on the late game ships. Our best in class for support has 12 entries. It's worth noting that nearly all of these are mainly frontline ships, so you aren't likely to pull them into a support role unless you are in real trouble. A few exceptions are that all of the Brigands variants made it to the support group, making it one of the best choices here. Additionally, the highest rated non-frontline ship is the Chimera, a well-deserved honor given its role as the best mortar ship in the game at present, and it is followed closely by the Osprey, Neptune, and Binglehopper, which are all notable support ships as well. The Osprey, though, might be considered a frontline ship, depending on who you talk to. The next is multi-role. These are ships that are versatile enough to perform in all three of the major combat roles that we test, meaning they can participate in lines of battle. They can work as a support ship and aid in a 2v1 combat, or they can even detach and work as either an independent fighter or a skirmisher. There's no full-on stack rank here, but the best ships have 18 entries. Most of these we've mentioned elsewhere, but new names to this list are the Gargoyle, the Griffin, Kirin, Ptarmigan, and Kraken. Note that the Retaliator and Osprey are both on this list. It's also worth noting that the Neptune has a 100% rating here, the only non-ship of the line to obtain that rating on this chart. And our final metric for today will be first strike, a metric which was mentioned in the reviews that we did but not explicitly called out on all ships. That's because for most ships it doesn't actually matter, and you'll see why here in a second. First strike is the statistically significant improvement we saw in combat results in favor of whatever ship was able to hit its opponent first. This is an average across all of the matchups, as individual matchups may have varying degrees of importance in first strike. As you can see, most ships hover between 8 to 12 in first strike rankings. This is a normal distribution, but several ships did fare better if they were able to hit first, going up to as much as 25% improved chance to win if you hit your opponent in the right angle and distance. Here are the top performers in this. That is all of the ships that can obtain a 15% or better first strike score. There are 10 of them. Note that nearly all of them are mortar ships, with the classic Fox performing the best in this overall. Of the non-mortar ships, these include the Marlin, Brigand, and Marauder, which come in near the bottom of this list, with the Marauder sporting the best overall maneuverability in this group, and the Brigand and Marlin carrying broadsides that can give an early edge in battle if they can actually pull off a first strike hit. And that's it. That's the review of our combat ship ratings. That was a ton of information, 2 hours if I'm not mistaken. I'll be packaging up these charts over the next few days and adding them to the website. Then I will be updating them as we get new data and information on each ship, so stay tuned. But while we do that, I want to thank you all for watching and all for your support in helping make this video possible, and I do look forward to seeing all of you in game.